Dear DataFest, I'm very, very happy to join this event. I was really excited to hear about it last year. This is the first time that I really noted about what's going on. I'm very happy that I can make it to join today. And for me, it's also a very, very welcome occasion to leave my sort of European bubble and see new perspectives and new people. My name is Sandra. I'm based in Berlin. As Piero has said, I work as an independent author and strategist, and I've published these 4 books. Over the past few years, I've specialized in the history of the field. So the history of infographics, information graphics, and data visualization. The 2 books that came out about the history are, one is called History of Information Graphics. It's a huge book with a broad overview from many, many centuries across many, many countries, which was a lot of work and a lot of fun to put together. And the other one, as Piero has mentioned, is more of a specialized catalog on one specific engineer. That is Charles-Joseph Minard, who is famous for the so-called Napoleon March. Many people may have heard about this graphic. And so the book shows all of his statistical maps in one book because very, very few of that was actually known to the public before. I have titled my talk, VIZ in the Wild. What does history teach us about crafting great visualizations? And it's interesting to me that ever since I started doing research in the history of the field, I get this question very often. So why should people look at, why should students look at the history of InfoViz? Why should people study it? What is the takeaway that we can get from that? And I would like to try and map out a few learnings here in this talk and show you some old works along the way so you get a little impression of what I've been doing. And I have structured my thoughts or my remarks into 2 chapters. First, I want to talk about the style of visualization, the design side of visualization a little bit. And secondly, I want to talk about the process of creating visualizations a little bit. And yeah, let me dive right into it, into my thoughts or remarks about style. The first thing when you look into the history of information graphics is that you see such an incredible variety of works, and that you see many, many works that to our modern eyes look strange, different. You don't get them, you don't understand the design, they look strange. So you really have to dive into the design and into the works and the context to understand it. And this made me realize that the design of any given work is largely shaped by 2 different dimensions, 2 different factors. And both of these are something that we don't really talk about or think about very much today. One is tools. What is the technology? What are the tools that are being used for creating a visualization? Today, that's mostly going to be the computer, software, something like that. But we also see a lot of hand drawing lately. So this is also how's the visualization created. And the other dimension that shapes the design very, very importantly is taste, design preferences. Something that is rarely ever reflected. I don't know very many people who reflect on their design preferences, on their tastes. As you know, those vary individually from person to person, but you also know that there's something like historical tastes. So they vary from, period to period. And I'll show you a little bit of that in a few works. I want to talk about these 2 dimensions of design because, as I said, I feel like they're largely unreflected in our work today. For the tools, that's mostly because the computer today is so ubiquitous and also provides us with so many options that we don't tend to think about what the design options of the computer are anymore. So it just goes unnoticed. And as I said, the other thing is that I don't know many people who talk or think or reflect about their personal design tastes and what a specific aesthetic means to them. Right, so let me dive right into it, and I want to show you a few I want to raise a little awareness about those things by showing you a few historical works. And I'll go backwards in time. That makes it maybe easier. And the first step backwards is early digital style, early computer. Let's go back 30 years to the year 1991. So this is one of the first visualization softwares. It was programmed by Ben Schneiderman and a team of his at the University of Maryland. So we're in 1991. The idea about the software is to show storage space. Okay, so you can imagine storage space was scarce, was expensive, disk space. And so they wanted to show which folders took up the most storage space. And looking at that, you can understand right away how restricted the design options were, right? So they really had to work with the digital typography that was there. They had to design for or work with low-res monitors. I mean, this is nothing like what we know today. They had to work with a very specific color scheme. And also, I mean, look at those frames and those things. It's really hard. So they also had an automatic text placing, right? So they couldn't, break the text in a way they wanted to. And so you see, it's really, really restricted in terms of design. And looking at that, you already get an idea and understand how much software has developed and how many design options we have today. I mean, there's so many ways today to tweak user experience design or the interface of a software today. And those were the days when there were no options like this. But this is just the first step of my traveling back. If we go back beyond the computer, all right, so this is behind, so to say, the 1970s. We have something like 5 centuries, 500 years, in which every sort of cultural production was really dominated by printing technologies. So there was a variety of printing technologies, different ones for book, for text, for images, and also for visualizations. But printing in general was like the dominant medium in which cultural things were produced. And I want to show you one technology that was really relevant in visualization for at least 2 centuries. And that, so we can get an idea about what the design options were that this technology enabled. We're talking about copper plate engraving. So this is a very wide map. It's some 1.5 meters wide almost. And it shows what is today the Canal du Midi. The canal still exists. It was built in the late 1700s. It was a major project, and it's the canal that connects the Mediterranean with the Atlantic in the south of France. So what you can see here is a copper plate engraving. How does it work? You scratch. You need a trained engraver. It's a profession. Somebody needs to train that. You need the engraver takes the drawing and engraves it into a copper plate. The copper plate is really hard, so what you get is really fine, very fine, thin lines. So you can be really precise in that medium. So you scratch it into the copper plate and then you print from that. And I don't want to imagine how much work this is, but what you get then is a very fine black and white print. And you can see that here it's pretty much the backbone of this print, black and white with like a standard printing graphic typography that they used back then. And what they would do then is to have somebody else sit down and watercolor this thing. So this was an extra step. The color wasn't printed. It was actually painted afterwards. And again, I don't want to imagine how much work this is. And but what it does is it not only enhances or decorates the map, makes it more beautiful, it also helps the reading, right? Because here you can see first of all, the coats of arms. People who knew those coats of arms would recognize them easier with colors. And also, for instance, in the landscape view and in the water gates that you see along the bottom, you understand it quicker because you see what is water from the fact that it's painted blue. And so if you look at this thing, for me, this is a really telling example because first of all, we have the design options that we get through the technology of copper plate engraving, as I've just shown you, black and white, fine lines, and then the watercolors on top. But then the other thing that you see in this design, and I think it's very strong, is a very specific historical taste, right? If you look at that, this is classic French culture. You're right in the Baroque. You can almost see the French king sitting in his castle in Versailles and looking at this map. You feel that this is a very specific period, right? And just as a thought experiment, imagine we would have to do this map today using copperplate engraving, right? So we would still be restricted by the copperplate engravings technology, right? But on the other hand, we would have a very different taste. I imagine today's designers would get rid of all this decoration and all these leaves and all that stuff. And instead, we would probably be using, bold typography and bold colors, and So this is the two dimensions that I'm talking about: the options you have through the technologies, but then also the design and taste preferences. All right, let me go one step further back. Middle Ages. Handmade, it's hard for me to imagine. I've been thinking about this for several years, but to imagine that every single book was written by hand and every diagram was painted by hand, no reproduction technologies, it's difficult for me to imagine. Every piece, every copy, every manuscript is different. And I want to show you one piece that is really mind-blowing and one of my favorites from the history. And it's a long roll. So what you see here are segments so that you can have several on one slide, but it's actually 3 meters, 3.5 meters high. So like as high as a high room. And it's a genealogy of Jesus. So you get the whole narrative of the Bible in this one thing. Basically, the whole narrative of the Bible in an extended tree diagram. So it starts with Adam and Eve. You see them here in the middle, in the top middle, with God in the middle, and then Eve and Adam on the sides. And then it, unfolds in events and stories and people all the way down to Jesus. And it's very interesting that you have the principle of storytelling already right here, right? It's not like the New York Times invented it 10 years ago. It's right here already. And the media technology, how is this created? I mean, technology is, much to be said here, but still, it's ink on parchment. So somebody would sit there and actually draw it. Parchment, some of you may know, parchment is very fine animal skin, like sheep or goat, very fine. And it was used before the paper was invented, so very prominent in the Middle Ages. And it's different from paper in that the surface is very smooth and slick. So the ink doesn't sink into it other than in paper. The ink will always sit on top of the surface. If we look at the detail, just to give you an idea, so we have a very reduced color scheme, just red ink and blue highlights, and then you have this like decorated type, and again, the technology is one side. You have the ink and you have to draw it and write it by hand, but then there's again a very specific medieval taste in that, right? So you see the way the figures are drawn and the way that the type is being decorated, this creates a very specific medieval taste. And so again, here you have this close combination of, what the technology enables and what the taste of the time is. And so, you would always see if somebody today tries with the computer to imitate a medieval style, it could go a long way, but then you still see it's made with a computer or something like that. So what do we have now? As I said, computers have become incredible design machines. They're like these imitation machines that can produce an enormous variety of styles. And that also mean that styles, sometimes I feel like styles are a little, ubiquitous. They can't just be adopted by adopting a template or something without really reflecting on what the style means. So these are taken from the Tableau Public Gallery, and I just want to show them for you to train that muscle in your brains, like, what does this style say? Rather than just adopting a template, it's like, what is the implicit message in any given design. For instance, in these here, if I look at the two white ones here on the lower left and the upper right, this is for me like, this says I'm science. This is hard science, this is hard facts. And the sort of the design tries to erase anything that's personal. So this is like as if the data are speaking themselves, right? And on the lower right, in the dark thing, this is something like, for me, the implicit message in the design is a different one. This is more like aimed at technological progress. This says, I work with technology, I work with software, I work with huge data sets, and turn them into a beautiful visualization that may be hard to read, but it's technological. It's technologically driven. So I think it's very worthwhile to think about these implicit messages that go with a design. And you all know that we have seen a lot of hand-drawn work lately. So here are like the most prominent proponents, I would say, of this hand-drawn style. And I feel like this hand-drawn style is sort of a reaction to the anonymous styles that we are seeing all over the internet. And so this is very different, right, from what I've said before. This is right. This puts the speaker in the center. Like Mona Shalabi is always like, I'm using public statistic, but it's me talking. So she actually puts herself in this. She makes clear that it's somebody speaking and that somebody is her. And so this evokes a really personal and subjective perspective rather than putting it in the shade. So what is the style? What do I want to say with that? Make your design choices conscious is something that I would like to formulate as a learning from the history. Which is the style that you are using, and what does it say about your perspective? Is there an implicit message that is conveyed in your design? For instance, if you like retro styles, if you like retro designs, what does that actually mean? Why is that good? What does that take? So it's important to both reflect the impact of both tools and taste. And that takes me to my second chapter, the process. I was thinking about calling the chapter The Miracle, because what I want to talk about is how you get from data to visualization, and how this process of these many, many steps is often obscured as if there was something magical involved. And I want to show you one work that many of you will have seen, one recent work for a change. It's the so-called climate stripes by Ed Hawkins, a climate scientist from the University of Reading. And it's a timeline, so it starts on the left, 1850, and so it goes all the way up to the present. You read towards the right, and each stripe is a year, and the color encodes the average temperature. So you get the point, it gets warmer. And this thing was enormously successful. So it was tweeted and shared like crazy, and it made the cover of the Economist magazine, and there was merchandising articles and stuff. So what is fascinating for me is, if you hear Ed Hawkins talk about this in interviews or something, you realize how many steps he has taken to arrive at that. It's been a very long process for him. He tried a lot of times until he found this. And but the point is, once you've created such a convincing visualization, the steps behind it, steps that led to it, are sort of obscured. It seems like a, miracle, sort of a result of a magical process almost. And I want to put emphasis on, the construction steps that it takes to create such a work. Again, looking at some two historical examples. This is one of the earliest data diagrams that I know. It was created by Nicolaas Kroekjes, a Dutch weatherman and cartographer, land surveyor too. And he took one of the earliest, as far as I know, one of the earliest extensive data collections about the weather. So there was a strong research impulse back in the 18th century to understand the weather better. And what he did was, for a whole year, he took measures from the barometer, so air pressure, 3 times a day. And plus, he documented specific weather conditions that went along with it, like rain, snow, hail, fog. And so then he wanted to document all of that, a year of weather data, into one diagram. And so here's what he did. You see the months running top down: January, February, March. And then you have the days of each month in the line. So January is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, all 31 days of January. And that goes for all months. And then you see the continuous line made up of these dots, and that is the measures or the data from the barometer, so the air pressure data. And so that was the question, how does air pressure relate to specific weather phenomena? And then you see, next to the days, you see additional symbols, such as little drops, little droplets, or little, snowfalls and little crystals, things like that. So these are on top of the days. And then below the days, you see the tiny, tiny little signs for the wind. And it's not just, was there wind? It's also which direction did it take and how strong was it? So a very, very refined way of showing a lot of data in this diagram. And it's fascinating to us because it is such an unfamiliar way of showing this kind of data. So as you know, this hasn't become a standard way of documenting the weather. This is why it looks so unfamiliar. And this also makes us note, okay, he had to really construct this. He had to come up with a solution to, show all this data in one diagram. And likewise, another diagram, early one, the earliest area diagram that I am aware of, by Charles de Fourcroy, French military engineer. And this diagram comes with a little brochure, a little text in which he explains what he did there and why and how. And the story he relates is that he's a military engineer, so he likes maps. He has a collection of city maps at home from all over Europe, cities all over Europe. And from each city, he has a map. And now he sits there and wants to compare those maps. And he can't do that because the maps are all to a different scale. So I can really sort of see him sitting there and like wishing to overlay the maps on top of each other to see which city is bigger than the other. And he couldn't do that because the maps didn't relate to each other. So he was like, okay, what am I going to do? And so he calculated the areas of the cities as the area of a square, and then overlay all those here in this diagram. And I'll show you a detail. So the cities of the same size are overlaid. I think we have here Warsaw in the middle with Amsterdam, and the outermost ring, as you can see here, is Petersburg, Paris, and London. And again, technically, this is a copper plate engraving with watercolors put on top of it later. We understand how there was no precedent for him to work from. Even the idea to use a diagram in the first place, in order to get this comparison, he had to come up with that. That was really extremely innovative at the time. And so we see how he came up with this idea and then constructed this, and like, what am I going to do with the axes and how am I going to make this work? So what interests me here is that both authors, they started with a set of data and wanted to come to their specific visualizations. But how do they get there? How do they get to their individual solutions? And it's not as if you only need a little bit of magic to then have those diagrams. It's more like Gropius really had to think about, how do I organize the 365 days of the year with each of them several symbols and several measures? How do I do that on one sheet? How do I show all this data on one sheet? How do I include the additional symbols? And the same goes for Fourcroy. What do I do with the true axis? How do I get all these cities in one diagram? What he started with was a list of cities and the data of their sizes. So what I want to say is the whole thing, get from data to visualization is a process that involves many, many, many decisions. It's labor intense. It involves many, many steps. And I'm emphasizing this also because today we are in the lucky situation that we have many, many software tools that help with visualization. But this point obscures that there's many, many decisions involved, right? Because those decisions that are taken are then often programmed into the software. The fact that you don't have to take the decisions, is just because it's already in the software. Somebody else has programmed them into the software. So, conclusion, visualization is not a miracle. It's a process with many decisions to be taken. And so it's very imperative that you master this step of it, that you are aware of all the decisions being taken, for instance, for specific chart types, for color schemes, for labeling styles, all of that. And software will make a lot of suggestions for that, but they also, all these suggestions are based on decisions that somebody has taken earlier. All right, so if I want to conclude my main messages, it is, I think, those two: choose your style. Maybe wisely is not the right word. I should have written consciously. So I want to raise awareness or want to raise consciousness for design options and design choices and why they are made. Choose technology wisely, in the sense of what are the options that I need to control? What technical options do I want? Do I need? And also which message is conveyed in my specific design, which is the underlying, in how do you say that, the message that's sort of not verbalized. And the second thing is craft your viz, and that was like sort of embracing this design process that I've just described, like going all these steps, using trial and error, being ready to go back and try a new way, and don't just use the first best template that the software tool offers. Also try user testing. Ask your mom whether any specific visualization works. That's also a good one. And I think basically these two, for me, sort of make a basic hygiene of visualization, of good visualization design. But I hope to have shown you that looking at historical work sort of emphasizes that even more. And so that was the end of my talk. I hope that it's a happy end, and I'm looking forward to taking your questions. Thank you very much.